In the name of God, most merciful, ever merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So welcome to this, should say session 5, lesson 4. Inshallah we have the right one. We do have the right one, okay. So the big question that we're trying to answer in this lesson, or the author is trying to answer, is about the proper methodology or approach or way that we can adopt to answer the major questions about worldviews. So very quickly, not to spend too much time on it. So first we said religion is made up of worldview and what he called ideology. And we talked a little bit about what a correct worldview would look like. And we said that worldviews are about answering the most existential questions that human beings have. So where do we come from? Where are we going? And what are we doing here? And then the next couple of lessons were about the necessity or the importance of studying religion and spending time trying to identify the correct worldview and ideology, this entire research. Why are we spending time and energy on this? So we said first, human beings have an instinctive desire to know, curiosity. They have an instinctive desire to lean towards anything that's beneficial to them. And they have a protective instinct against anything that may be harmful and dangerous to them. We said that most psychologists say that there is a sense, a dimension in the human being psychologically that they refer to as the religious sense. And we also talked about the logic of probability. So those were 4 arguments that we presented about the necessity of studying religion. And then the last lesson was about, and it's in the same topic, but the author decided to give it a full lesson because of its importance as an argument, and because there's a lot more subject matter to cover. So this becomes the 5th reason why we study religion, which is the human being's instinctive leaning towards perfection. Anything that gets a human being a step closer to perfection, he's going to instinctively lean towards it. And anything that pushes him away from his perfection, whatever he sees as being his perfection, he will get away from it. So now that we know all of this, the question becomes, so maybe the last transition I'll make before jumping into this. We said that the perfection of a human being is in making sure that their voluntary actions, which is the ideology, their voluntary actions are stemming from a correct worldview. So the question becomes, how do we reach that correct worldview? What are the ways to getting to the answers that constitute the questions of a worldview, which is where do we come from, what are we doing here, and where are we going? Many others, but these are the major ones. So what he's going to try to do, the author, in this lesson is to present 4 different ways that human beings have customarily adopted to walk towards the worldview, to go towards a worldview. These topics in general are covered in philosophy, the way they're going to be presented here. They're covered in a branch in philosophy called epistemology, which is the study of the theory of knowledge, or the theory of knowledge. So philosophy has many branches. The classic way of studying philosophy, one of the ways, and I'll explain why it's the classic ways and maybe not used too much today, was to say that philosophy is split into big branches, one of them being metaphysics. So metaphysics is anything that is non-physics, because it used to be all lumped together. So in the books that Aristotle wrote, there was a book called Physics, so basically the physical world and nature, as we call it today, natural sciences. And then there was a book after that that was referred to as metaphysics after. So that's all it meant at that time. But with time, because the subject matter covered in that book that was after physics was all about existence and knowledge, knowing existence and existence, which later became known as metaphysics. It became this much deeper field in philosophy. So the theory of being or existence and the theory of knowledge, so the theory of being is usually referred to as ontology, and the theory of existence is referred to as epistemology. So all the topics that we'll talk about today, directly or indirectly, are usually studied in the field of philosophy, in the branch of philosophy called epistemology. So what can we know? What's the best way to know it? That's all the theory of knowledge. So the author is going to present 4 big ways that have customarily been used to go towards, to try to reach the answers of how do we get to a worldview? What's the correct worldview? So the first one that he's going to present is what he refers to as the empirical or the scientific, or we can call it the experimental worldview. And this is basically relying on your sensory perception to see the world, to experience the world. And from there you develop an entire worldview. The second way is the rational, or what he refers to again and again as the philosophical worldview. And so basically, it doesn't only rely on the empirical data that you get from your senses, you actually use your mind a lot more and you build much deeper rational arguments. A third worldview that he talks about is the religious worldview. And to be honest, maybe it shouldn't be sitting at the same level as these other worldviews, but because of its preponderance and its importance for people like us, Muslims, believers, he put it at the same level. But we'll see that he actually says that it's secondary, and we'll explain why it's secondary. Because it's relying on data that's coming from the other approaches before you can just say this is coming from the religion. You can't just jump into the religion before saying where you're drawing your source, your primary data. And finally, he talks about, and we spent a lot of time on that last session after the course, about what we have referred to here as the direct religious experience. So what can be referred to as Sufism, mysticism, gnosis or Gnosticism, and so on and so forth, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So once he presents these 4, and he spends a lot of time on the 4th one, he goes into a little bit of an assessment to see basically, can we rely on any of these to get to the correct worldview, to the correct answers we need from a worldview or not? And then we get our conclusion. So we start with the first type of knowledge, the empirical knowledge. So empirical knowledge is basically anything that we learn through our senses. So if we observe the world through our 5 senses. We can see it, we can touch it, we can feel it, we can taste it, and we can smell it. So anything that we know about the world, which today is called natural sciences, comes from these 5 senses. The approach, the methodology of using your senses to acquire data and information about the world is called empirical. So you're relying on empirical data, which is data that you can use your senses to get to, but we can also call it experimental because you can take it and replicate it in an experiment in a lab, for instance, in a laboratory. So, and the other way to refer to this one is the scientific methodology, and this is based on the fact that all of science, all natural sciences, are based on this type of information. So information that you can gather through your senses. So the first point is the source of this data. It's sensory perception. So you're getting whatever you perceive or observe from the world through your senses, the 5 senses. Added to that, I wrote here abstraction and generalization. We don't have that many thinkers and philosophers nowadays who really push on this point of pure materialism and who reject the rational faculties, but they have existed a lot in history, and there are some today as well, which basically say anything you know has to be experienced and there's nothing but experience. Right now, I'd say there's kind of a consensus that reason has a big role to play, and there's a jump from the data that you're getting to what your mind can do with it to create what we call abstractions, So you're able to look at the thing that you're looking at and take away from it characteristics and look at those characteristics independently of the thing. For instance, you can look at something, a ball that is white, and you can look at the ballness of the ball. You can look at the whiteness of the ball. These are different characteristics. Your mind is able to distinguish between these characteristics that are not found by themselves in nature. Whiteness doesn't exist in nature. It's always in something. Your mind is able to abstract it. And generalization. So you're noticing there is no notion of chair. Any human being that knows the meaning of the word knows that there's a notion of a chair, and when you see it, this chair or that chair, one of them is small, one of them is, these are two different chairs, and I can tell they look very similar. They're different, in a lot of ways they're different, but I know they're still both chairs. How? Your mind is able to generalize. So when it looks at different things, whatever they may be, when it looks at them, it can distinguish between what's common to them and what's distinct. And it can remove different levels of common and distinction. And this creates what we call a notion, so it's a chair, or in philosophy and logic you'll have a species, a class, a genus. This is by looking at higher levels of common, right? I can look at human beings, but I can lump them together with other primates. I can lump them with mammals. I can lump them with animals in general. I can lump them with things. This is different ways that your mind can abstract and generalize. All that to say, yes, the data that we're getting is purely through the senses, but then your mind is doing something with it to be able to create generalizations or laws in physics or chemistry or biology. Your mind is playing a role there. So the source of the information is coming from the sensory perception. The main field of that kind of information is usually applied in the natural sciences. And there's a lot more we can say here, but we'll go a lot faster. I wrote this next citation or quote because a lot of people, especially in Arabic, they mention it and they say this is a hadith. This is not a hadith. Man faqada hissan faqada ilman. This is not a hadith. It doesn't come from any prophet, or maybe it does, but not in our sources. This is most likely something that Aristotle would have written. I don't know exactly where Al-Farabi refers to Aristotle saying that, but I don't know where it is, and whether it's paraphrasing Aristotle or quoting him directly. I don't know what it is in English, for instance. But generally speaking, we definitely agree with this. So a human being, let's say, who cannot see, they have lost a sense, they have just lost an entire world of knowledge to them. That type of knowledge can never be gained in any other way except through sight. And so the point of mentioning this is we do recognize the validity of sensory perception as a valid source of knowledge that cannot be gained through any other means. We have to agree on that. And so, of course, we can go through all sorts of examples here. The point that might be very important here to mention, because it's going to come back in the fourth type of knowledge that he's going to mention, is that sensory perception is direct, it's immediate. So yes, the mind may do something with what you have perceived or observed, but when you first get it, it's immediate. There's no intermediary between you and what your eyes have seen. You don't need an additional layer to get what you have perceived in whatever sense you're getting it from. So it's a direct perception. If you put your hand on the heat, you feel the heat right away. So it's almost, we can refer to it as existential experience. It's a direct experience, which is not going to be the case in the next two. So based on this, what kind of worldview do we get if this is the only way we want to look at the world? We get what we can call an empirical or experimental or scientific worldview. And so we'll come back to that at the end, but I think it's clear enough what kind of world you'll have. It's purely materialistic, and it's a worldview that you can understand, apprehend, observe, manipulate through the senses. There's nothing less and nothing more. The second type of knowledge is what he refers to as the philosophical, and I think towards the end of the lesson we'll talk a little bit more about the terminology. He keeps consistently referring to it as philosophical. I think it's more accurate to just call it rational, but we'll come back to that at the end. So just let's use the terminology that he's proposing. So the source of this kind of knowledge comes from where? Comes from the mind. So again, we're trying to see all the different kinds of information and knowledge that we can have, and how that is going to help us reach the correct worldview, so that we don't lose sight of the question. So this type of knowledge is entirely relying on reason. So he mentions the words, it's very dense in Arabic. The English version, it's not that it's less dense, but the translator has decided to translate them in much simpler terms, so that he simply used the terms abstraction, it is an abstraction, but there is a discussion here that he completely eliminates by simply calling it an abstraction. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. I just want to mention the terms so that if ever you encounter them, because they're in the book, if ever you encounter them in Arabic or in other more advanced courses, you at least know what the words mean. So he refers to them, he calls them al-ma'qulat al-thanawiyya. So he says the reason here technically is al-ma'qulat al-thanawiyya. So these are what I called here, not abstractions, I'm calling them second order intelligibles. So an intelligible is something that your mind can apprehend, can understand. Al-ma'qulat al-awwaliyya in classic philosophy, for instance, not to complicate things too much, al-ma'qulat al-awwaliyya, for instance, if you look at the notion of fire or the notion of burning, you can see it directly. You look at a fire, you look at it again and again, and you see that it burns whatever you put in it. So the notion, what is fire, or what is a human being, or what is a pen, that's called al-ma'qul al-awwali. So you're at what they call, sometimes it's referred to, and I think I wrote it, mafahim mahawiyya. So it's the essence of the notion. That's what you're looking at the first order. At the second order, you see what you can extract from that notion, or what applies to that notion. So you're no longer in the world where you're observing and interacting with the world and getting something out of it, which is a notion. You're doing something with the notion. So it can be a relationship of logic, for instance. So if you say, when you put something in the fire, it burns, therefore, this is going to be the second order intelligible, causality. That's a second order intelligible. Causality doesn't exist. It's a law, a principle, a relationship that your mind is creating by extracting it from things that it observes in the world. So this is a second order of intelligible. Its first order is you notice and you abstract it into a notion, an idea, a thing that your mind can manipulate. And the second order, you do something more with it. So in this case, your brain, your mind was able to create this principle called causality. So in Islamic philosophy, this would be split into two, because you have second order intelligibles that are philosophical and some that are logical. So a philosophical one is another layer of complexity, like causality. Logical would just be, for instance, how you sequence or order things, such as when your mind says, this is a genus, and this is a kingdom, and this is a class, and this is a species. These are different ways of lumping things together. This is a logical second order intelligible. In any case, I thought I'd just make sure that the words are clear in case you encounter them again. And we don't need to spend more time on this. Basically, he's trying to be very accurate in the way he says what is considered a philosophical way of thinking about the world. So he's giving you examples, these kinds of relationships that your mind is able to extract. This is what he's referring to as the philosophical thinking. So the field of this type of thinking, or this type of knowledge, is logic, mathematics, and philosophy. And all of these, we're working with very abstract notions, and your mind is at the first or second order of intelligibles. I don't think we need to explain that more. And so basically the worldview that you create, the world that you live in, if you want to rely on this type of thinking, is all based on rational arguments. Yes, your perception might be something, but you don't rely on it. Your reason has to validate it. So this is a second, different way of looking at the world. The religious type of knowledge. So now we're at the third. So the source of this type of knowledge, when we say this is a religious type of knowledge, religious is not the right term. I'm using the term as it appeared in the book. Religious is not the real term. Because he doesn't say that this type of knowledge is dini. It's not religious, it's ta'abbudi. So maybe a word about ta'abbud. What does it mean? Because it's a term that will appear in all Islamic fields and all sorts of works and lectures. And the term ta'abbud basically means, to simplify it a lot, basically means when you follow religion blindly in a very positive way. Okay, so you follow without questioning. You don't need to question. I don't need to question why Fajr prayer is 2 rak'at. This is ta'abbud. Maybe there is no reason that I can ever understand why it's 2 rak'at. It stops there. This is ta'abbud. Sometimes they refer to it as tawqifi, the same word. So if you hear tawqif or ta'abbud, it's kind of referring to the same thing. More details I don't think is necessary. For instance, when they say there's a whole huge topic, since we're in aqa'id and beliefs, there's a very big topic about the attributes and names of God in theology, in Islamic theology. They say, are the attributes and the names of God tawqifiyya or not tawqifiyya? In other words, are they fixed? And another way to say it, are they religiously prescribed, or can we come up with new names and attributes to God at any time? Can I just come up with a way to describe God that is very personal to me and I use that in my prayer? Or do I have to take it from some religiously valid authority? A prophet or an imam or the Quran or a dua or somewhere that says, yes, you may refer to God in that way. So this is not the topic, I'm just giving an example. So this whole topic is only referred to as tawqifiyat al-asma. So the prescription of the names. Is it prescribed? Is it imposed on you? Or is this something that has more flexibility? So ta'abbud is the same way. So the argument or the type of knowledge, the third one, is about ta'abbud. It's about when your religion, when the religious leader that you have accepted, when the religious book that you have accepted says to do, you do. Or it says, know this, you know it. This is a type of knowledge and a source of knowledge that is very different from your perception or your reason. Sometimes your religion will say something and give you a reason, and then your intellect will work and say, I accept, I reject, it's strong, it's weak. That's different. Here we're talking about when religion says something and you take it as is, and you apply it, whether it's a belief or it's an action. The second point here is that, and he actually talks a little bit about this, and we'll get back to it again, is that it's secondary. He says this is thanawi, or secondary. Why is religious knowledge secondary? Because you can't just jump into it and without having established the worldview first. Without having established what do you do with your sense perception, what do you do with your reason, what do you do with everything else that we're talking about today. If that's not established first, you would not have reached the conclusion that I'm going to follow religion. So it's always secondary, but he's presenting it as one of the direct primary ways of acquiring knowledge, and therefore it becomes a worldview. So the field, obviously, is all religious teachings from whatever you consider a religious leader or / religious authority. It could be a book, it could be a person, it could be a movement, and of course this doesn't apply only to Islam. So anywhere that you look in the world, you may see some of this happening, although they may not always refer to it as religious. Yeah?
So this is only the Adyan Samawi, or no, like it can be Buddhism or
it could be anything. It doesn't even have to be religion.
Oh, okay.
It could be science. Yes.
And so is it possible he's mentioning this also because a lot of people do skip that first phase and jump into this straight away?
Yes, absolutely. And we'll mention that at the end, as we'll explain a little bit more what he will say is the correct way to basically walk towards the worldview. And we'll see that he's going to say it's a philosophical way or the rational way, and why. And part of the reason is that, exactly. That you can't just jump into it, otherwise you have a circular logic, and we'll talk about that. So here I mention it very quickly. The only thing I think that requires a little bit of a nuance for this type of knowledge, or that requires a bit of sensitivity, or it's delicate, there's a difference between when you look at something that comes from a religion, there's a difference between accepting it because of the authority of where it's coming from and accepting it because it's logically valid or it's reasonable. So yes, your religion may be giving it to you, a religious leader, and of course I'm talking much more general than our religion, but apply it to our religion as well. You may get it from your religion, but you don't necessarily accept it because you just want to follow your religion. Sometimes we do. And sometimes, even our scholars will give you a reason. We have that even in some of our hadith, and we have that in the verses of the Quran. When we have a hadith that say, it doesn't just tell us, fast. It says, Sumu tasahhu. In order so that you may have better health, fast. So it's giving you a rational reason. It's not saying because God said so and you will follow. No, it's giving you a reason. Other things, we don't have a reason. As I mentioned, 2 rak'at salat al-fajr. We don't have a reason. We may not. It's arguable, but really we don't. And this is something that he mentions very quickly in passing. And so it may be useful in other areas. So I mention it as well without explaining it anymore. But obviously this type of knowledge can be a lot stronger for the believer because it's belief than any other type of knowledge that you may have. Even though you may not be able to establish it based on logic, based on your senses, based on any philosophy, because it's a belief, your belief can be a lot stronger in something even if you can't rationalize it than knowing something but with not having belief in it. And for the worldview, obviously, we can all have a religious worldview. So I don't think I need to explain that one much more than what it is. So basically, you're going to see the world in the manner in which your religion or your religious leader or authority is telling you to see the world. Yeah.
You said it's stronger, the religious would be stronger than the other two? Without taste or the authenticity, like the reliability of the source of information, without to be stronger.
It may be in the eyes of the believer.
In the sense of the reliability of the information?
Yes.
Okay. In that sense?
But it may not be true.
Yeah, but we might not be true.
It's a perceived reliability. It's a perceived authority. Yeah. And the fourth that he talks about, the fourth type of knowledge that we can have and from which we can create an entire worldview that he presents in this lesson is, we have called it previously the religious experience, so we'll just keep calling it the religious experience or the direct experience. So this has many, many terms, many notions and a lot of terminology and ambiguity around the terminology. This can be called ishraq, this can be called shuhud, this can be called tajriba ad-diniyya. This has many words depending on which discipline looks at it and which school looks at it, and so on and so forth. So basically what we're talking about here is specifically religious experience, but it can be in the broad sense of what we call religious experience. That is always existential and immediate. So you experience a phenomenon, an activity, something directly. So you're the only person who has access to it. And we'll get into a little bit more explanation. In Islam, traditionally, this has been related to what we discussed last week, which is Sufism, Gnosis, philosophy, mysticism, those terms generally speaking. And in Arabic, they refer to them as Rabbaniyin, Ilahiyin, Muta'allih, Mutasawwif, and so on and so forth. Arif, sometimes. So why do we say existential or immediate knowledge? So by presence, not by acquisition. So this is a distinction that we'll need for later lessons, so we'll talk about it very quickly for now. Generally speaking, in Islamic philosophy, they split knowledge into two big kinds. They say that knowledge is either huduri or husuli, and then there's further splits after that. So knowledge, when it's husuli or acquired, it's basically any knowledge that you acquire through any means. You have to work for it and you get it, and there's an intermediary. There's work. It's never automatic. It's not immediate. It's mediated by something. It's mediated by a book. It's mediated by a person. It's mediated by your effort to go get something. And that type of knowledge, when it's acquired, obviously can be right, correct, or incorrect. It may be true or false, like anything else that we know in life. And the reason is, and this is all philosophy agrees on this, whether this is now used metaphorically or not, the way you know something is by creating a mental image of it to yourself. So you do not have the thing in itself. You have an image of it in your mind. That image may or may not correspond to it. And this becomes the source of the mistake. That's why the knowledge can be correct or incorrect. To the extent that your mental image corresponds to the external reality, this is considered correct knowledge. So what's the difference between this and knowledge by presence, or al-ilm al-huduri, as they say? And there are other ways to refer to it in English. I'm usually referring to it as existential knowledge or existential experience. It's something you feel at the level of your existence. It's immediate. In other words, the thing in itself is present to you. So it's not mediated. The knowledge that you have and yourself become one. That's how it's explained, especially in later Islamic philosophy. If we go to Mullah Sadra and others, they directly talk about this. But this dates all the way back from Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd. They all refer to this. They say, Ittihad al-aqil wal-ma'qul. The unity of the knower and the known. So what's an example of this? The unity in the first case is with your mental image. Yeah, but it's just an image of something. It's not with the thing in itself. So in this case, the thing in itself is present to you. Like what? For instance, when you feel pain. There's no mental image of the pain in your mind. The pain itself is present existentially to you, so you feel it. When you feel sadness, so the first case, it's a physical feeling. Second case, it's psychological, but it's a feeling. Where you apprehend a thought, no one needs to explain to you what's going on. The thought is present in itself to you. These are all types and examples and instances of knowledge by presence. The thing in itself is present to you. What people who are seeking the religious experience are trying to do is to acquire the religious teachings directly. So they want the religious object of knowledge to be present in itself to them directly. I don't want to read about it. I don't want you to explain to me what an angel is. I want to see one, I want to touch one, I want to feel one. These are very different types of knowledge. So what we're talking about here, the direct experience or the religious experience, that's what it is. It's very different from someone who is explaining it to you. If one of you guys now tells me, for instance, I'm hungry, I have a theoretical knowledge and an acquired knowledge that you are hungry, and I understand it, but I don't have hunger. You have hunger, so you have the existential knowledge of hunger. Hunger is present to you, but the image of hunger is present to me. So this, we don't want to go into too much more detail about this distinction between these two types of knowledge, but it will become important as we progress in the course in general. One distinction that is very important to make is, and this is always made in the books that are correctly written and that present this topic well, the religious experience has to be looked at from two angles. It has to be split into two things. The experience itself and then the interpretation of the experience. These are not one thing. My interpretation of what I'm going through is not the same as what I'm going through. Especially if what I'm going through is complex, abstract, it's the first time that I go through it, this distinction becomes more and more important. If it's the millionth time that I do something or I feel something, you know, there's nothing special there. But if it's the first time ever that I feel pain, or I taste, I don't know, someone who has never tasted anything sweet, you can explain to them all you want what sweet tastes like. If they don't know what sweet is because they have tasted it, they'll never really know what it is. And once they taste it, the experience that they have, this immediate experience that they have, will not be the same as when they taste it the 10th time. So the first time is probably the time where we will see the clearest distinction between what the experience was itself and how they're interpreting the experience. Because usually human beings, when they interpret something, you can only interpret based on everything else you know and you've experienced. And this is an important thing to keep in mind. So two people may have a very similar experience, but their interpretation of the experience may be very different. Because of their baggage, because of their history, because of their knowledge, because of their piety, because of everything else they've experienced before. So again, a distinction to keep in mind. The correct way, he doesn't talk about this in the book, but I think it's important to maybe mention it very quickly. The classic way that this is taught to people who want to go on this wayfaring, as they call it. So they want to start purifying their heart and their soul and akhlaq and arfan amali, as they say, practical gnosis or practical mysticism. They say there are 3 big steps. And of course, this can be split into 1,000 steps, which has been done in some books. But the 3 big steps are these. So first of all, it starts with takhliyah. So what is takhliyah? It's basically emptying your heart and your soul from anything and everything that is not God. That's the first layer. So it's a cleansing, purification process. That's why I put a little minus beside it. It's negative. It's pushing out everything you don't need. The more you do that, the more you get ready for the second layer, the second step in your process as you walk towards God. The second one is at-tahliyah. So basically you adorn, you decorate, you beautify yourself for God. Yourself as in your heart and your soul. So this is a positive one. Now you want to be an entity that God wants to look at. You want to be an entity that God wants to like. So what do you need to do? And so this is an entire phase of practical teachings that we have. Once you've done these 2, then you're ready for the 3rd phase. And the 3rd phase is what they call at-tajliyah. So at-tajliyah, now you have become yourself, you illuminate or you shine or you're bright. You're so clean that you reflect the divine light. And it's to the extent that you're pure, it's to the extent that you're clean, your heart is clean, your soul is clean, that you can reflect the divine light. The more you're clean, the more you can reflect the divine light. This is when you start experiencing what we call the religious experience. It's at the tajliyah. There's a reason why we're mentioning this. This is the classic theory in Islam about going towards the religious experience. Those who wish to have the religious experience. You're not supposed to do it for the religious experience. You're supposed to do it because you want to be nearer to God. The religious experience becomes a symptom or an indication that you're on the right path. It's like a gift that you get from God because you've walked in that path. You're working on yourself. It takes discipline. This takes a long time and it takes a lot of effort and it's not easy. And then you start experiencing things. It could be in your dream, it could be in reality, it doesn't matter. You start experiencing things that give you an indication that you're on that path. This is to keep in mind as we'll talk about the end. Can we actually build a worldview based on this or not? This is important. So all this to say, the worldview that we create based on the direct experience is obviously one where the truths that you accept have to have been all experienced directly. Otherwise it doesn't count and you reject it as part of your worldview. And we have entire Islamic schools of thought that believe in this. So the big question now that we went through the big four schools, which type of knowledge allows us to build a correct system of beliefs and answer the questions that form the worldview? Right? That we did all of this to get to this point. So now he's going to assess the four types of knowledge that he gave us. Empirical knowledge. First problem is that it's limited to the material world. So anything that doesn't fall into the material world, if there is anything, we don't know. There might be, there might not be. The claim is that there is more than the material world. But we'll never know if we rely on this worldview. So we already see one huge limitation there. One. Two, it's limited by fields and disciplines. So not only, and this is more of a polemical answer if we need to go there, not only is it limited in terms of it stops at matter, so if anything is outside of matter, it gives us absolutely no way to deal with it. That's one. Two, even within matter, there's no consistency. And that's why we have so many disciplines and so many fields. Let's say I became the greatest physicist in the world. Does that make me any more knowledgeable in psychology? No. And vice versa. If I became the greatest psychologist, both of them are empirical fields. Does one of them allow me to say, therefore I'm an expert in the other? Therefore I'm an expert now in sociology or in biology or physics or chemistry? I can't. I have to study each one of them on its own. It has its own laws, its own methodology, its own tools. Which means that there is no one consistent approach to look at all of this. That's another limitation. Keep that in mind. At least not yet. I don't think I have enough time to talk about this. Generally speaking, there has been a lot of claims, and there are some still today, that we can refer to very quickly if you want to look it up, because I don't have time to talk about it. It's called reductionist materialism. So basically, it's the kind of materialism that says there is nothing except matter. The real claim, if they want to be consistent with this, is that if I understood, let's say, an atom and all the physical laws around it, let's say this is the smallest particle we have, and I understood all the physical laws, I have an infinite knowledge of what an atom is and how it behaves, and since everything that exists is made up of it, then I know everything. I should be able to predict how a society will function, because it's nothing more than atoms together. Depending on which situations and circumstances we have, it'll behave in a certain way, but I'll know that. And the reality is today, no one has been able to move in that direction. There are theories that are coming up that are trying to move in that direction, but the day they'll be able to get rid of one of the big fields, then we'll know at least they have made a step in that direction. Until then, every field is stuck in itself, and we have nothing very highly consistent that brings the entire material world together. And that creates all sorts of problems that we don't have time to explore now. So long story short, because of these limitations, we can't really call it a worldview. If we want to rely on empirical data, we cannot say that we are going to be able to answer the questions of where do we come from, where are we going, and what are we doing here if we're looking at the material world. As we mentioned at the beginning, reason, sorry I wrote reasons here, reason still plays a role. So even those who want to be, if they want to be consistent and true to themselves, even those who say it's all material, their own reason is still playing a role in abstracting and generalizing from the data. And of course, what we get today is this big movement towards science equals the new religion. Okay, and it's no one in that world wants to call it what it is, but from the outside it's usually referred to as scientism. So when you make science into a worldview, when you make science into a metaphysical system, what it's not meant to be, it doesn't have the tools, it cannot address those questions, and yet it makes these claims that are metaphysical, and it wants to explain to you where do we come from, what are we supposed to be doing here, and where are we going. Anyways, and so I'm just mentioning two very quick books here if anyone wants to look at these two different ways of looking at the world. The God Delusion, which is Richard Dawkins' book, and Evidence of God in an Expanding Universe. So both of them looking at science, but reaching very different conclusions. Religious knowledge. So this was the third type of knowledge that he talked about. As we said, it has to be secondary. Secondary not in the sense that it's secondary in importance, not at all. It's not secondary in significance, not at all. It's secondary in logical order. You cannot get to it without having first established that there's a God and that there's a prophet and that the prophet is so-and-so and he came with this book, and then I can go see what the book says, or I can go see what the Imam says, or I can go see what the prophet says. So we cannot just jump into the religious aspect. That's one. Two, the circular logic. So why do you believe in the prophet? Because the Quran tells me. Why do you believe in the Quran? Because the prophet tells me. That's circular logic. Where's your house? Beside the pool. Where's the pool? Beside the house. I don't know.
I wish that was the case.
Some days, yes. Okay. Does it mean that religious knowledge is not wanted, or is that it's not good, or it has no place? Absolutely not. But it has to come in the right sequence, in the right order, and that's what you refer to. We can't just jump into it blindly. If you haven't established your worldview, your philosophical system, then your religion is just floating in a vacuum. You haven't established why you came to this in the first place. So you're following blindly. Once you have established those things, and once you have answered those questions, as we're going to say philosophically, then you can come to religion and it will give you all the details you need. So it gives you specific and detailed teachings. And of course it relies on the logical authority of the messenger. So you cannot say this type of knowledge is religious knowledge before you have, as you said, established the authority of whoever or whatever is giving you that knowledge. The religious experience. I'm going to go quickly here. I think most of the brothers who are arguing this are not here today.
We can continue with the next one. So it might be for the community.
Sure.
Like
Yes.
maybe 10 minutes.
I'll stop. Give me 2 minutes to finish this. It shouldn't take too long. The religious experience, and he spent a lot of time on this in the lesson, but I don't think we need to spend too much time on it. The objections that he's going to give against the religious experience making your worldview, four, he's going to give four, and the fifth one I'm taking from another one of his books. This is only in the case that the religious experience is true. He does not even address the possibility that this is not even a real religious experience, or that someone is lying, or that someone is trying to dupe others. This is the case where someone has had a religious experience and they believe that it is 100% true. They are innocent, pure, sincere in their belief that this is a true religious experience. So what are the issues with that? Basing an entire worldview on it. First of all, a worldview is supposed to be a rational system. This is a system that answers those questions. This is not going to be answering those questions. The religious experience is an experience. It doesn't answer questions. It's just an experience. It doesn't provide answers on its own. You have to interpret. One. Two, difficulty, impossibility of expressing what's going on to anyone else. How do you put it into words? And that's the example that I used. If someone has never felt pain, how do you explain pain? If someone has never tasted anything bitter, how do you explain bitter? It's very difficult. So the best, brightest minds are going to be struggling with this. So I'm saying it's extremely difficult, but really it's impossible because it's a dimension we don't have access to. And that's why when you read the literature that comes out of these schools, they talk about wine and getting drunk, and if you read Hafiz and Rumi and others, that's what wine. They don't know how to explain what's going on. They have to use the closest thing that they can conceptualize to their experience. So the trance and the feeling of losing completely yourself into something, okay, well, it's like I'm drunk. Okay, that's the closest thing I can come up with. It's not that I'm drunk, they're not infatuated with wine, but they keep going back to this metaphor because that's all they have. 3, confusion between experience and interpretation, and we can talk a lot here. First of all, sometimes, and he talks about this in another one of his books, he says you may feel hungry, and then later you say, actually I wasn't hungry. You may feel mad or sad about something, and then later you realize, maybe I wasn't really sad about that thing, I was sad about something else. Which means even when we experience, we might make a mistake. We're not making a mistake in that we experience something. We're making a mistake in how we're interpreting the experience, as usual. The character flaw. Sometimes we have character flaws. So they're going to change the way we interpret the world. If I have an issue, I'm going to interpret the way you look at me as he looked at me because there's envy or hatred, or it's a character flaw. It's my way of interpreting the world based on my character flaw. And we're all flawed. 3, lack of knowledge. As we said, I have no experience, I have no knowledge, and I'm experiencing something. I have nothing to work with to allow me to interpret what I'm experiencing. 4, implied exceptional spiritual maturity. This one is very important. To be able, and that's why we talked about tahliyah, tahliyah, tajliyah. In order, if it's true, based on what we believe as Muslims, if it is a true religious experience, then you probably have a very sophisticated and advanced worldview, and very sophisticated and advanced ideology. You've finished all of that a long time ago, and this is not going to help you create an ideology or a worldview. You're already there. It defeats the purpose. You've been there for a very long time. So anyone who reaches this, they've already acquired the worldview they need. And the fifth one that he doesn't mention in this lesson, but it's available in Ideology al-Muqarana and other books of his, is that it's absolutely subjective. So how are you supposed to take your subjective personal experience that no one else has ever experienced to someone else? And what are they supposed to be doing with that? So the bottom line of all of this is that we shouldn't look at the religious experience as giving us 2 scenarios. People are either saying the truth or lying. So-and-so is a good guy, he had something that he saw in a dream or in reality, therefore it must be true. Because the only other option is that he's lying, and he can't be lying, we trust him too much. Actually, there is one more scenario. He might be mistaken. His interpretation might be incorrect of what he experienced. Conclusion. So the conclusion is that, from everything we saw, there are limitations to the empirical worldview, to the religious worldview, because it can only come in second, and to the religious experience. So what's left? The philosophical worldview. What he refers to, and I put it in quotation marks, because it's not really philosophical in the sense that we might learn when we go to university and get a BA in philosophy. It's philosophical in the sense that it's all based on 100% certain reason. That's the meaning of philosophical here. Does this mean that we need specialized philosophical knowledge? We have to spend 10 years studying philosophy to create a worldview? Absolutely not. You only need whatever you think you need. And that's why we have these narrations when the Holy Prophet asked a woman who was sitting working on a manual sewing machine in his time, do you believe in God? And she said yes. And he told her, how do you believe in God? And she told him, well, this machine would stop moving if I stop moving it with my hand. It won't move. So this whole world with everything that is in it, this movement that we see in the world, doesn't it require a hand to move it? And so the Holy Prophet, it is narrated that he said, "Alaykum bidin al-ajaiz." You should follow this religion of these old women. There's a reason he's saying that. It's simple and 100% accurate. It's instinctive, natural religion. True worldview equals exclusively philosophical arguments. Does it mean that we reject any other type of knowledge because it's not philosophical? Absolutely not. It's not exclusive. The worldview, the big questions have to be answered in a philosophical argumentation, but the data that you get can come from anywhere. The sub-arguments can come from anywhere. And that's why, for instance, I'll just use the unawareness of the soul. If psychology says that you can have something happening in front of a human being and they're not aware of it, when all of their senses are functional, psychology just established, perhaps, that there's more to a human awareness than the senses. And maybe this will lead to a philosophical argument proving the existence of the soul. Okay, so I used psychology and empirical data for that. This is the homework. The example here, I wrote example, verse 22, chapter 21, and verses 27, 28, chapter 38. I'm not going to talk about them, but it would be nice if you could look at them and see what type of worldview and what type of knowledge is coming from these. Where do you put it? Is it philosophical? Is it religious? Is it religious experience? Is it empirical?
Surah 22, verse 21?
22, yeah, verse 22, chapter 21.
Verse 22.
Yeah, the verse and then the chapter. So the second one is two verses, verses 27, 28, chapter 38. Surah Sad. Certainty and beliefs. All of this is because we believe that to build a system of beliefs, you have to have 100% certainty. Belief cannot be built on conjecture and probabilities. And this is a very important point that we're not going to expand on now, but to keep in mind. He finishes with this point, so I'll finish with it. He says that all of this, if it's valid and it's properly built, your philosophical system is properly built, then you can start moving towards what we call the religious experience to purify your soul. Because now you're sure that your philosophical system is correct and you have a correct belief system. And that's all we had. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
No, keep it going. You wanna? Is there anything to discuss? Any Q&A about this specifically? Yeah, for a few minutes. Yes.
I just have a question. You said how about the direct religious experience. Didn't the Prophet basically have a direct religious experience? And so you said you can't believe it because what if it's true? What if he's lying? What if he's innocent and mistaken? So how do we know if it's true, lying, or he's mistaken?
So this is a big topic, and we talked a little bit about it last week too. We do not entirely base on our belief in the Holy Prophet because there's no time to discuss, so I'm just jumping to the answer. We do not rely entirely on the Prophet's claim that he had an experience. There has to be a lot of supporting evidence before we consider the personal subjective experience as a proof itself. So in the case, in the case of the Holy Prophet, what else do we look at?
Quran, for example.
Okay, but what is the Quran? What is the claim? So we have to look at the content of the claim. We have to look at
Miracle. Miracle.
And the miracle. And that's why I'm like, let's expand it beyond just our prophet to all prophets. When they come and they make this claim, the point of the claim is not that they had a religious experience. The point is that they're trying to guide us. So before we embark on this, we have to see what's going on. What are they claiming? And what are they providing as supporting proof for their claim? And this is when prophets start providing miracles. So there's a supporting proof. It's not that we question. We can question or we cannot. Let's say we're good Muslims and we believe right away. What about the others? If their questioning was not valid, God would not have given the prophets miracles. It means you are allowed to question because you're not sure. God wants you to be 100% sure that this is right and you're going to follow it, and this is wrong and you're not going to follow it. A lot of people claim prophethood, and that's why I didn't talk about the other side, which is what's a false claim. What if someone has a mental disease? They suffer from schizophrenia, and it makes them hallucinate and see things. And maybe it's innocent. They're not trying to dupe you. So how do we know? And this is where you have to add all the supporting evidence for prophethood. And this is going to be an entire chapter that we're going to talk about over multiple lessons that's coming. Yeah.
Sayid, there's a verse that comes to mind when they ask for a miracle, and there's a verse comes down, is the Quran not sufficient as a miracle? And it leads me to think maybe the Prophet's greatest miracle is that of reasoning, that of mantiq and rationale and logic and philosophy, because in the Quran that is what is supported a lot and endorsed heavily. in comparison to other religions where maybe it's, you think of Nabi Musa, you think of this miracle right away, or Nabi Isa, this miracle right away. But when it comes to the Prophet, I think his greatest miracle to me was to have the ability to influence the Arabs of that time. Because imagine the Arabs today, how hard they are to influence. So I'm thinking he had to deal with the mindset of the Arab 1400 years ago, and to have the ability to educate him and to bring him to this conclusion through his reasoning is, to me, is the miracle itself. You see?
So this is a very big part of the miracle nature of the Quran. And inshallah we'll have lessons where we talk about the miracle of the Prophet. But we cannot look at the Quran as a miracle on its own. We have to understand the philosophy of miracles. So you take it from the beginning that we know. We look at the different kinds of miracles that the prophets have come up with. Were they random, or is there a logic to it? And what we can find is usually the miracles are compatible with whatever was happening at that time, so that it's convincing to the experts in that society. So in the time of Musa, magic was the thing that would impress the biggest experts and that would have the biggest impact in society. So the miracle came through that way. Whereas apparently in the time of Isa alayhi salam, medicine was seen as something very, very impressive. And so the biggest experts and most influential were the medical doctors or physicians. At the time of the Holy Prophet, it's balagha. The whole world of the Arab nomad living all alone in the desert, all he has is his eloquence. So the Quran came to challenge him in what is considered the most impressive. And this is the philosophy of the miracle. That's one thing. The second thing is there's always an evolution. So the Quran, the way we understand it is, while there's an up and down, generally speaking, it's moving towards maturity. Societies are maturing. And that's why when we reach the end, the last one, which is the Quran as we believe, it has to be the most complex. It has to be the most valid for all of eternity. So while the miracle that was provided by another prophet may have been good at some time, it's miraculous, and we believe it is miraculous. But maybe today some people will question it. Maybe there is some technology that will allow me to heal someone who's blind. Who says that's a miracle? Because society is advancing. So the challenge is, so what miracle is going to be eternal? And this is the link with human reason. Is, let's see what your reason can do. It will never match this. And this is the entire Quran in all of its dimensions. It's not one. It's not just eloquence. It's not just science. It's not just the laws of society or economy or politics. It's all of it taken together. Match this. Or the Quran goes lower and says, match one chapter or match one verse or 10 verses. So you have to look at it from all of that, and then definitely 100% that's what it is. So there's an evolution in the maturity, which is going more and more from the very material miracles, which is when we read the story of Habil and Qabil in the Quran, their names are not mentioned, so based on riwayat, Habil and Qabil, we see it's about, or even Bani Israel were in the desert, there's a fire that comes and eats your sacrifice. It's very materialistic. And then you fast forward and then you reach the Quran and what it explains as what's happening in the womb, or what's happening in the heavens, or the movement of the sun and the moon, and something that's completely different. Now we want you to use your reason. Yeah, absolutely.
A verse that comes to mind is about the desert Arabs do not say that you believe, but rather you submit because faith hasn't entered your heart. So those desert Arabs seem to be using religious knowledge. They're just accepting because they're told to accept.
Yes.
But faith hasn't entered their heart, meaning they haven't used reason to build that faith. Rather, they're just jumping to the religious knowledge.
Your argument is 100% correct, but the verse is a lot more direct than that. The verse is basically telling them you haven't even reached the minimal. Yeah. Because basically all they did is say, a shahada, and in their minds that's enough. They've entered Islam and they've become Muslims. They don't even have what you're thinking about as religious knowledge or religious, they have nothing.
They just shahada.
Yeah, and in their minds they're good enough. That's it. We're doing what God said.
Let's see if sisters has any questions. Sure. Okay.
I have one last
Okay, one last question, and then we'll
Yes.
leave the rest for the next
Next
question.
one. Yeah.
Say, last week you said something that in today's world is full of multiplicity and subjectivity, and it's no longer a world of absolute